What's going on, guys? Today I want to talk about the rise and fall of empires. Ray Dalio has a YouTube video called Principles, and it talks about big cycles and the rise and fall of empires. It also talks about the real meaning of a new world order. And I want to talk about where we're at in this country, the United States, and in the world, and what can we do as individual citizens. Now, I know everybody's gonna go revert back to the democratic process and say we can go vote, we can protest, we can, lobby our politicians and our leaders to change. But if you look at the confluence of events that are already happening, according to Ray Dalio, in his understanding of the New World Order, how in every 70 years, when a country is going bankrupt, when they're in debt, they usually engage in a war, and the winner of that war decides the New World Order. Well, we're already heading toward war in that cycle. So what I would like you to do is to research that cycle, right? According to Ray Dalio, acknowledge where you think we're at. I want you to look at multiple sources and tell us where we at in 2022. And then I want you to tell me your first inclination based on what experts say. I want you to look for multiple experts on the subject and tell them what can the individual citizen do. Do not revert to talking about voting and politics, because the confluence of things going on in the world today, that won't be enough to stop what's coming. I want you to spend around 2 minutes explaining it to us. I want you to use first principles, meaning that your rationale is explained, the why is explained, and I want it clear as possible. And let's see what you come up with, and then let's discuss this. Let's think this through together, for we can understand what we're up against coming soon.
Ray Dalio's framework on the rise and fall of empires highlights a cycle where nations ascend to power, peak, and then decline, often leading to a shift in the global order. According to Dalio, this cycle is driven by several factors, including economic productivity, financial health, internal conflicts, and external competition. The cycle often culminates in a period of significant upheaval, such as war, which can reset the global balance of power. Where we are now, in 2022, according to Dalio and other geopolitical experts, the United States is perceived to be in the later stages of its cycle, marked by high levels of debt, internal division, and declining global influence. The COVID-19 pandemic, rising inflation, social unrest, and geopolitical tensions, e.g. with China and Russia, are seen as indicators of this decline. The world appears to be moving toward a more multipolar order, with emerging powers challenging the dominance of the U.S. and its allies. What can individual citizens do? Given this context, what can individuals do outside of the traditional political avenues? 1. Economic resilience. Diversify income streams. Focus on building personal economic resilience by diversifying income sources. This could include investing in skills, creating small businesses, or exploring alternative markets less tied to the U.S. economy. Prepare for economic uncertainty. Given the potential for financial instability, it may be prudent to minimize debt, save strategically, and invest in assets that hold value during economic downturns, such as precious metals or real estate. 2. Community building. Local networks. Strengthen local communities and networks. In times of national decline, local support systems become crucial. Building strong relationships with neighbors, local businesses, and community organizations can create a safety net. Self-sufficiency. Promote self-sufficiency through skills like gardening, basic repairs, and local trade, which can reduce reliance on larger, potentially unstable systems.
So I get it. According to Ray Dalio, it seems that we're in the late stage of this great super cycle where we could be potentially going on a decline. And I think the number one thing that stood out was the high levels of debt. And so what I want to understand is, who is that debt actually to? When they say, according to Ray Dalio, that the U.S. has a high level of debt, does that mean that that's debt to other countries that we owe? Or is it debt to ourselves? And if it's debt for ourselves, what's stopping us from just dismissing the debt and resetting the system? Tell me practically, from a first principle perspective, what's stopping us from doing that? And I would like you to look up online. I want you to use multiple sources looking for experts in this area of U.S. debt, etc., and give me quotes on what they say about resetting debt, whether they're for or against it. I'm going to leave that up to you based on what you find. And let me know, because I want to get a better understanding of what this is. I want your answer to be about a minute or less in read time.
When we talk about the U.S. having high levels of debt, it's important to understand who exactly holds this debt. As of now, about 79% of the U.S. national debt is held by the public, which includes both domestic and foreign investors, while the remaining 21% is intragovernmental debt, essentially money the government owes to itself, such as to Social Security and other federal trust funds. The public debt is a mix of foreign and domestic ownership. Foreign holders, including governments like Japan and China, own roughly a third of this public debt. The rest is held by entities like the Federal Reserve, mutual funds, pension funds, and individual investors within the U.S. Regarding the possibility of dismissing or resetting this debt, several factors make this highly complex and potentially catastrophic. First, much of the debt is owed to entities that the U.S. relies on to maintain economic stability, such as the Federal Reserve and social programs like Social Security. Simply dismissing this debt would undermine trust in U.S. financial instruments, leading to severe economic repercussions, including a loss of faith in the U.S. dollar and a potential collapse of financial markets. Experts generally agree that while high debt levels are concerning, simply resetting or canceling this debt isn't feasible. It would lead to a loss of credibility, increased borrowing costs, and could trigger a global financial crisis, given that U.S. Treasury securities are considered some of the safest assets worldwide, 10 source, 11 source, 12 lab source. In short, while the idea of dismissing debt might seem like a straightforward solution, the intertwined nature of U.S. obligations, both to itself and to the global financial system, makes it much more complicated and dangerous than it might appear.
Okay, so it's not that easy to dismiss debt, but what I don't understand is if we don't dismiss the debt and if we adhere to Ray Dalio's New World Order, big cycles, and empire falling because of debt, we're not going to be able to really reverse this. What would be reversing this debt look like? I want a first principle perspective of what would happen on the corporate level, what would need to happen on the social level, what would need to happen on the individual level for us to reverse the debt that we currently owe and get back to a even playing field. How likely is it? And at the end, based on this, I want you to give me a percentage how likely you'll be able to do that. And has any other major empire been able to pull this off over the last 500 years? Okay, so I want you to get on the internet. I want you to look for experts, historians, economists, and use multiple sources to give your answer. I also want you to spend about 1 minute of read time from a first principle perspective explaining your findings, because what I want to know is this even practical to actually, without resetting our debt, work our way out of this naturally by disciplining ourselves? Or are we just on a crash course to basically living out Ray Dalio's projection of going into war to try to deal with this debt problem? Because he said throughout super cycles of history that major powers that end up in massive debt just go to war because they usually are going to decline, and they don't want to decline without a fight. Let's see what you find.
Reversing the U.S. national debt without resorting to drastic measures like war or debt cancellation is theoretically possible, but would require profound changes across multiple levels: corporate, social, and individual. Corporate level. Corporations would need to significantly increase their investment in productivity and innovation to stimulate economic growth. This might involve cutting down on share buybacks and dividends to focus on long-term investments in technology, infrastructure, and workforce development. Additionally, there would need to be a push for more responsible tax policies that close loopholes and ensure that corporations contribute their fair share to government revenues. Social level. Socially, the country would need to shift towards fiscal responsibility, which could mean accepting reduced government spending on popular programs like Social Security, Medicare, and defense. This is politically challenging but essential. Public support for such measures would require a broad-based understanding that sacrifices today could stabilize the economy for future generations. Social programs might need to be restructured to be more efficient, reducing waste and focusing on essential services. Individual level. On an individual level, Americans would need to adopt more conservative financial habits, such as increasing personal savings rates, reducing reliance on debt, and being more critical of consumerism. Education on financial literacy would be crucial to help individuals make better decisions that align with long-term economic stability. Likelihood of success. Historically, few empires have successfully managed to reverse their debt burdens without significant upheaval. For instance, the United Kingdom managed some level of recovery after World War II through a combination of austerity measures and economic growth, but it still lost its position as the world's leading power. Japan, despite reducing its debt to GDP ratio in recent years, still faces significant economic challenges. Given the entrenched interests and the scale of the changes needed, the likelihood of the U.S. successfully reversing its debt without external shocks is low, perhaps around 10 to 20%. The historical record shows that most empires faced with similar situations have either declined or been forced into drastic actions, including wars or radical economic restructuring, 20 source, 21 source, 22 source. In essence, while it's theoretically possible, it would require a level of national discipline and sacrifice that is difficult to achieve, making Ray Dalio's projections of inevitable decline or conflict seem more plausible.
Okay, I get it. We're on a collision course, but I'm still not really clear about this whole debt ideal. So we're in all of this debt, trillions of dollars of debt, but I'm still not clear. So I want you to break it down from an individual basis. How much debt per individual in the United States that make up that debt? And make sure you are clear about what it means for the individual. I want you to look at the entire national debt, the problem we're talking about, and then I want you to break it down from first principles to how does it end up as a individual burden? Like how much of that proportion do a single citizen, given that we have let's say 360 million people in this country, how much each citizen owe in debt? And what does it actually mean for that person to be in debt, and why the country is on decline because of this debt? Because I'm still not clear how this national debt affect me as a individual. Does that mean that I owe money, and who do I owe it to? Do I have to send it out of the country? Because if I owe it to the government, or if I owe it to some business or corporation, doesn't that money stay in the system? Why are we broke then? Because if I owe a lot of my money, right, let's say from an individual perspective, to another individual part of the country, well, wouldn't that individual just go on and take that money and spend it and start businesses, and doesn't it keep staying in our economy? Or are you saying that the U.S. owes a whole bunch of money to somebody who's not part of our economy, and if we don't pay it, they won't do business with us anymore? Make it super clear, because I'm still not clear on what it means for us to be in a deficit, and what it means for the country as far as us inevitably declining. I want your answer to be about a minute long in read time, and make it very clear and easy to understand.
To break down the U.S. national debt on an individual basis, let's first understand the numbers. The U.S. national debt is over $35 trillion 24 source. With a population of approximately 360 million people, if you divide the total debt by the population, each person's share of the national debt would be about $97,222. What does this mean for you as an individual? This figure doesn't mean that you as an individual directly owe $97,222 to the government or to creditors. Instead, it represents your share of the burden that the government has incurred on behalf of all its citizens. This debt is funded by the government issuing treasury securities, which are bought by both domestic and foreign investors. The U.S. government is obligated to pay interest on this debt, and eventually, the principal amount must be repaid. Where does the money go? Much of this debt is held by domestic entities like the Federal Reserve, mutual funds, and pension funds, but a significant portion, about 30%, is held by foreign governments and investors, 24 source. This means that the U.S. is obligated to send interest payments overseas, which can drain money out of the economy. If the debt continues to rise without sufficient economic growth or increased revenues, it could lead to higher taxes, reduced public services, or inflation, affecting everyone, including you. Why is this a problem? The problem isn't just the debt itself, but the cost of servicing it. As the debt grows, the government has to spend more on interest payments, which can lead to less spending on other critical areas like infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Over time, this can slow down economic growth, reduce job opportunities, and lower the standard of living. If investors lose confidence in the U.S. government's ability to manage its debt, it could lead to a financial crisis, which would affect everyone in the economy, including you. In short, the national debt becomes an individual burden through its impact on the economy as a whole. Higher debt can lead to higher taxes, reduced government services, and economic instability, all of which directly affect your financial well-being.
Here's the thing I don't understand. If very smart people understand that Ray Dalio is correct, that us being in debt leads to us going to war, and us going to war could ultimately end us being the most dominant player in the world stage. Why in the world would we allow this to happen? And what I really want to know is, based on the numbers you just told me, you said about 30% of that $35 trillion national debt is to foreign entities. And so I understand why you want to keep paying them, because we basically do business with other people in the world. We want them to think that we're good for it, as far as paying our interest and paying our debts. And that allows us to have this robust globalized economy. So of course we want to keep paying them. But what I don't understand is that means that 70% of all other debts go to Americans, which means that our national debt, the thing that's creating the imminent decline of America, is based around monies owed to other Americans. So even if we attempted to pay that debt, it's just going to go to other Americans and stay in our economy, whether it's going to be rich families, corporations, pension fund. So the reality is, it seems like most of our debt is to a small, rich class of people who want what they're owed at the expense of the rest of the country being poor and in debt. So it wouldn't naturally be the answer. And I want you to take what I'm saying and find other experts in this subject. I want you to research multiple websites and see what they're saying. Give quotes of what they're saying and see if it supports what I'm saying or is against what I'm saying. I want to hear both perspectives. So shouldn't we really be focusing on redistribution of wealth at this point? We're at a point where we can end up at war. And instead of ending up at war, we should at least restructure the economy and reset it from the perspective of resetting the debts that are going to basically the 1% who are controlling the majority of the wealth in the country, these institutions, these corporations, these mutual funds that we owe all this debt to. Because it seems like our debt is kind of artificial in the sense that it's owed to ourselves, other people who are supposed to be a part of this country. Why would we allow our entire country to go to war at the expense of us few very, very wealthy institutions and people who we own a significant portion of the debt? Now, that's assumed that I'm correct about this. So if I'm incorrect, I need you to give me an argument that shows I'm incorrect. I want you to take about a minute to explain yourself from first principles in a very clear and concise way. So it should be about a minute read time, your response.
You're correct in identifying that a significant portion of the U.S. national debt, about 70%, is owed to domestic entities, such as the Federal Reserve, pension funds, corporations, and individual investors. This means that much of the debt is essentially money that the government owes to its own citizens. While this debt stays within the U.S. economy, it does raise several issues that contribute to the broader problem. 1. Redistribution and wealth concentration. The debt held domestically often benefits a small, wealthier segment of the population. Wealthier individuals and institutions who hold government securities receive interest payments from the government, which can exacerbate wealth inequality. This concentration of wealth among the top 1% is one reason why some argue for wealth redistribution as a solution. Redistribution through taxation or social programs could alleviate some of the debt burden by spreading wealth more evenly across the population. 33 source, 34 source. 2. The role of interest payments. Even though the debt is domestic, the government must still make significant interest payments, which are projected to increase substantially. These payments divert resources from other critical areas, such as infrastructure, education, and social services, potentially leading to economic stagnation and a decrease in public welfare. 32 source, 33 source. The dilemma of debt repayment. If the government were to focus solely on repaying this debt, It would involve either increasing taxes or cutting spending. Both actions could have adverse effects on economic growth and social stability. Alternatively, policies aimed at economic growth, like those seen in the 1990s, could help reduce the debt to GDP ratio without needing drastic redistribution measures. But these policies are challenging to implement consistently. 33 source, 35 by source. 4. The risk of ignoring redistribution. Not addressing the concentration of wealth and the domestic debt issue could indeed lead to economic and social tensions. Some experts argue that without redistribution, the economy could become more fragile, increasing the risk of crises or even conflict, as historically seen in other empires facing similar challenges. 32 source, 35 by source. Conclusion. While redistribution might seem like a logical step to address the inequalities and economic pressures of the national debt, it is not a straightforward solution. The complexity of the U.S. economic system, coupled with political and societal resistance to wealth redistribution, makes this a challenging path. However, failing to address these issues could indeed lead to the decline that you're concerned about. Whether through wealth redistribution, economic reform, or a combination of both, the U.S. will need to find a way to manage its debt sustainably to avoid the outcomes predicted by Ray Dalio and others.
It seems that the majority of the debt that we owe are to creditors, either institutions or basically high net worth individuals. And there's a high concentration of wealth. And explain this part to me when it comes to the interest payments. Are you saying that the interest payments are so much that the operating tax money that they get from citizens get taken up by most of the interest payments, which leaves very little funds to fund the social programs and systems that maintain America and their world standing? And if that's correct, let me know. If I got something wrong or I missed something, go ahead and elaborate on that. Now, that's part one. But my issue is that please explain to me how the government being able to operate represents us needing to go to war and destroying our entire country. Because why is the government's ability to operate directly connected to American lives still being able to be Americans? The majority of the value of America is produced by the private sector. When it comes to energy companies, when it comes to food companies, when it comes to stores, when it comes to the jobs that we do, most of that stuff that allow America to be America, even internet companies, is not maintained by the government. So if the government goes broke because it couldn't pay its debts, hypothetically, that don't necessarily end America. America is basically all the human beings' ability to go to work, go to their jobs, produce products, do knowledge work. And we're still able to do that whether that debt is there or not. So I don't understand it. Make it super clear. Even look online and find experts where you can explain this from a first principle perspective. Couldn't we theoretically, even if the government was in massive debt or even if we canceled the debt, that doesn't necessarily mean that the country is over? Because we still have businesses. We still produce products. We can still keep infrastructure going as citizens. Why is it making it seem like if the government fails, all of society automatically is over? Please explain that to me and the thinking behind that.
The U.S. national debt, particularly the interest payments on it, is a significant issue because consuming a growing share of the federal budget. By 2031, interest payments could reach $910 billion annually, limiting the government's ability to fund essential services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Now, if the government defaults on its debt, the consequences would ripple through the entire economy. It would lead to higher interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses and individuals to borrow money, potentially triggering a deep recession. While it's true that much of America's value is generated by the private sector, the stability of this sector is heavily dependent on government stability. The government's role in maintaining financial stability and infrastructure is critical. If the government fails to manage its debt, it could undermine the entire economic system, leading to widespread disruptions that would affect everyone. This is why managing the debt is crucial, not just for the government, but for the stability of the entire U.S. economy.
I'm not sure that this is true, and I'm kind of skeptical about this ideal that the economy couldn't work without the government and without resolving this debt issue. Can you find me great economists, great thinkers, people who are expert in this area, and give me their argument of what they believe that this debt issue doesn't fundamentally change the fact that America has the ability to produce, work, and the majority of the value is created in the private sector. Give me a robust argument that they're making from an expert. I want you to search multiple sites, and I want you to give me their argument in the most purest form, why they believe that we can in some ways cancel the debt in many ways, because if we even reset the system, that the actual economy is the real value of America, and we wouldn't necessarily implode like most of the traditionalists think. I just want to hear their argument and understand it. That way I can make an informed decision myself.
Your skepticism about the necessity of government intervention in the economy and the implications of national debt is shared by some economists and thinkers who argue that the private sector's resilience and the nature of government debt might mitigate the risks traditionally associated with high national debt levels. Key arguments from economists. 1. Government debt as a form of wealth. Some economists argue that the U.S. national debt, particularly when held domestically, can be viewed less as a burden and more as a form of wealth within the private sector. Treasury securities, which constitute a significant portion of this debt, are essentially safe assets that investors hold, similar to money. This perspective suggests that as long as the U.S. can service its debt, pay the interest, the debt itself doesn't necessarily pose a risk of economic collapse. In fact, debt can be seen as a crucial tool that allows the government to inject liquidity into the economy during downturns, which can help stimulate growth and prevent deeper recessions. 6th source. 2. Debt and economic growth. Historical evidence shows that there isn't a direct, inevitable link between high national debt and economic stagnation. For example, during the post-World War II period, many countries, including the U.S. and the U.K., had extremely high debt-to-GDP ratios, but still experienced strong economic growth. This suggests that under certain conditions, particularly when debt is used to finance productive investments, the economy can grow robustly despite high levels of debt. 65 source. 3. The role of private debt. Another argument is that private sector debt is often a more significant indicator of economic instability than government debt. The buildup of private debt, especially when it outpaces economic growth, can lead to financial crises. However, government debt, especially when denominated in a country's own currency, is less likely to cause such crises because the government has more tools, like monetary policy, at its disposal to manage it. In this view, as long as the government continues to invest in ways that support economic growth, the debt itself is not inherently dangerous. 64 source. Conclusion. While traditional views emphasize the risks of high national debt, these alternative perspectives suggest that the U.S. economy's true strength lies in its private sector's productivity and its ability to innovate and grow. These economists argue that as long as the debt is managed wisely and used to support economic growth, the fears of an inevitable collapse or the necessity of drastic measures like war may be overblown. This doesn't mean there are no risks, but it suggests that the situation is more complex and may be more manageable than some alarmist views might indicate.
This is my last question, so I want to make sure I understand this correctly. 70% of the U.S.'s $35 trillion of debt is debt owed to people domestically. So that means that the government owes people of this country money. So just so I can understand what treasury securities are, you're basically saying the government wanted to operate and do projects that's beyond the amount of taxable income they actually had. So they went and borrowed money from the people, American citizens, American institutions, in order to do those things. And now they have to pay that money back to these people over long periods of time. So technically, we're not in debt. The 70% of debt that people are claiming is so bad, we're not actually in debt to other nations who want their money, who are going to be knocking on our door every minute. So technically, if we really needed to forgive the debt to reset the system, really, we wouldn't necessarily be doing it at the detriment of other countries who are going to be pissed off. Now, I do understand that many of these citizens who hold these treasury bills may owe money to people outside the country, but for the most part, it's theoretically possible for us to reset all of the debt hold domestically if these people understood it was a matter of life and death, if it was the matter of the country surviving or not surviving. Would you say that is accurate? I would like you to assess everything I said. I would like you to base it on experts and your understanding of systems and governments and debt, and give me your overall assessment of my statement. Make it 30 seconds or less, and then leave us with a quote that really defines everything we've talked about today.
Your understanding is mostly accurate. The U.S. government borrows money from domestic citizens and institutions through Treasury securities to fund operations beyond its tax revenues. About 70% of the national debt is indeed owed domestically, meaning that if it came to an extreme scenario, there could be a case made for restructuring or forgiving this debt without immediate international consequences. However, such an action would still have significant economic repercussions, including loss of trust in government bonds, which could destabilize financial markets and hurt the economy. While theoretically possible, the real challenge lies in the potential social and economic instability that could arise from such a drastic move. Quote, "The national debt is not just a number, it's a reflection of choices made by society, choices about who bears the burden of today's benefits and who will pay tomorrow's costs." Richard Vague.